But Markus Söder has announced that his party is going to run for the next general election with a gender parity electoral list. The CSU, that is his party, is formally a different party from Angela Merkel's party CDU, but informally. And this is something that I'm not just saying about them, but this is something they will openly say to you if you ask them. Informally, they form kind of one party. Legally, the CSU is a party of its own, but informally, it is actually the Bavarian chapter of Angela Merkel's party, the Union. And the situation is as such that the CDU is the part of the party that is running for all the offices outside of Bavaria, and including the constituencies for the parliamentary seats in the federal parliament outside Bavaria, and the CSU is running inside Bavaria. They have made an agreement that members of the CSU are not running outside of Bavaria, and like versa, CDU politicians do not stand for office in Bavaria. As you can imagine, Bavaria is much smaller than the entire rest of the country, and yet this gender parity electoral list reflects on the dynamics we see all over the country. There are a number of parties that have announced similar moves. Some have already moved beyond that, and it may even affect how other parties, first in Europe and then all over the Western world, may be composed in the future. It also scratches the entire topic of how we vote our lower chamber of the parliament, the Bundestag. Is that a democratic process in the first place? Because after all, it is quite interesting that a list that is supposedly composed in a democratic fashion can be predetermined by the party leader as to contain so many people with one characteristic and a different set of people filling the voids. Our Constitution Grundgesetz says in Article 21, parties contribute to the formation of the political will of its people, and their formation, not the formation of the will, but the formation of the parties, is not obstructed. The internal order must be democratic, or must be in line with democratic principles. That's Article 21. So why is it important in the first place that we have electoral lists, and what are they doing? This has to do with our election system for the lower house, the Bundestag, which is a personalized, proportional system. This means it is a composite election system. So we have the first past the post system in place alongside the proportional system. And the way it works together is fairly complicated. On the one side, every constituency that is electing a parliamentarian into his office will see this parliamentarian in the office. However, only half of, or not even half of, the parliament is elected in that fashion. Half of the seats are reserved for the list candidates. And the way it works is that you have basically 2 ballots per person. One ballot is for this first constituency-based normal system, where your candidate makes it into the office if he accumulates the most support from his voters. The second vote, however, goes into the lists. The parties can be elected in the second vote, and they are counted, and then it is looked at the proportion a party has gained in the election. So I give you an example. The CDU had in the last elections cycle in 2017 32.9% of the votes. Now the entirety of seats in the lower house of the parliament is 598. That's a lot of seats. Now you still don't have a perfect proportion of the party in the overall parliament if the number of directly voted members of parliament for the normal, ordinary, first past the post vote, the first ballot, is lower than the percentage the party achieves through half of the parliament seats already allocated through the first ballot. So in this example, in 2017, the CDU achieved through the first past the post normal election system 231 constituencies, voted members of parliament into their offices who were also members of the party CDU. The number of seats that are elected directly and is in excess of what is proportionate according to the second vote is called an overhang mandates. Now, according to my calculation, that is 34.2 seats or 34 seats. The real number, according to Bing, the Bing search of those overhang mandates, overhang seats, is 36 seats. So why does my number differ from the number given by the search engine Bing? I don't know. You can play around with it a little bit. For example, you can adjust the percentage received by the CDU on the second ballot by taking out all the votes cast for parties that did not make it into the parliament. We have a 5% entrance bar. That means parties that don't accumulate more than 5% of the votes in the second ballot, they won't be represented in the parliament at all. So you have some votes you can cast out, and if you adjust for that, actually, that doesn't help, because a larger share in the second ballot and the second vote means that there is an overall smaller excess over the votes that have been won with the first normal election procedure. So that would result in only 24 seats following the same calculation that I just showed. So I don't know really where it comes from, but the actual problem is that most Germans actually don't know that. And our Supreme Court has decided whatever excess seats our constituencies have voted in, knowing the faces, etc., being answerable to those constituents, those seats must be offset by party list seats from the other parties. And I could spend days figuring out why it was ultimately 36, but I just leave it. The reality is that I'm not a dummy, and nobody understands it. Basically nobody. Of course, there are a few people who will understand it, but the reality is that the legitimacy of our political leadership is very questionable if people don't know how to operate the system with which we in a democracy are supposed to give ourselves our laws. This is the definition, and a country that has a claim to democracy must fulfill this basic requirement. I hope you're still there, because this is also relevant to the English-speaking world. New Zealand has introduced this election system fairly recently. The difference is that they don't reserve half of the parliament to the electoral lists, but a much smaller portion of it. And I think Wales and Scotland also have very similar election systems. However, they also are smarter than we are, reserving less to that to the list. Now, what is the problem with that system? The problem is that the control over at least half of the parliament is totally in the hands of party leaders. So while your constituency can decide the candidates for half the parliament, the party leaders basically decide on their own how the rest is produced. How the lists are composed. Of course, this is something our politicians will never admit, but if Markus Söder can come out and announce that half of the elected entries on the list will be women, you can tell that he's manipulating the thing, otherwise he would not know in advance. So now let's have a look again at the Constitution. It says a party must have an internal order. And I have found on the Parliamentary Research Organization, Wissenschaftlicher Dienst, a publication that was discussing a proposal of the Green Party at the time, and they had kind of a legal assessment of whether that could go forward. And in that document, which I will link up below, and as always, you can use Babelfish, Google Translate, or whatever translation tool you want to check my sources. In that document, they say that making those lists is a part of the overall election. They call it a Tatbestandsmerkmal. So making this election, so the statutes of the party and the election process within the assemblies, is a character of the action of the general election. Even though it is internal to the party to constitute those lists, it is still an act of the general election, because this influences to a large degree how at least half the parliament will be seated. Therefore, the compilation of these lists must be conducted in a way that aligns with the overall constitution. And this is also specified in the Constitution itself. In Article 38, it says the representatives of the Deutsche Bundestag, the parliament, are voted in a general, immediate, free, equal, and secret election. Those words mean that general or universal means that every citizen can take part. Immediate means that there is no second institutional body that is sending the MPs as delegates. Like, for example, the US American president is elected through the Electoral College. This is usually the only example that we are given because I don't know any other constitutional construct that works like this. I think it is supposed to give some legitimacy to the chancellorship, which is formed in the image of the British prime ministership. So it's actually a very different thing from president, and it is supposed to be a representative of the parliament. You know that the prime minister is not voted by the people. The people come to vote representatives of the constituents, and those representatives are actually responsive to those constituents, and the prime minister is really only the spokesperson to talk to the outside world, and is the best representative of the representatives, the representative of the body, of the constitutional body. But the people don't come to vote the prime minister. They come to vote their delegate. They come to vote their representative of their constituency into the parliament. And the prime minister really is only a function of that body. Yes, the prime minister cannot know in advance what the parliament is going to do. He is only the best representative. His voice is just most likely to be a good match with the overall consensus in the House. But he has no sway over the House. He has no say in it. And this is totally different from the chancellorship. The chancellor is actually far more controlling of the parliament than a British prime minister would be. And while we are not told that the British prime minister were voted in immediate fashion, the distinction between immediate and an immediate vote is made, I think, to suggest to the public that the Americans and the British alike have somehow a same-ish system, which they don't. And the Chancellor is elected by the Parliament. Therefore, the legitimacy usually is derived from the prime ministership in Great Britain. The difference, though, is that the Chancellor has actually far more power than the prime minister, rather presidential powers, in fact, while he, like the prime minister, is not actually voted. The prime minister is only a representative of the body of the parliament that is voted. In Germany, it is usually seen that even though that's not constitutional, even though that is not the legal way it is done, but it is seen by the public that the chancellor is basically voted in a mediated fashion, and the parliament, and this is somehow seen, this is normalized, the parliament is seen to be staffed, to be voted in the process, in the pursuit of voting the chancellor. So the legitimacy of the Bundestag is actually rather weak, because nobody voted those legislators. They were just voted in the pursuit of voting something else. And the other principles are free, equal, and secret, and I think this should be fairly obvious. However, this is where it becomes interesting, because those principles are not just relevant for the active voice or the active vote, but also for the passive one. That means that every candidate who runs for the office must have equal chances of actually getting into the office, or in this case, is a position on that electoral list. If you design the electoral process in a fashion that your chances are reduced because of your gender, then you run into conflict with the equality principle that's also true for the passive vote. You have to have equal chances to be elected, no matter if you're a man or a woman. Those principles are, of course, also reiterated in the ordinary laws. So, for example, the federal law for the election, the Bundeswahlgesetz. And as I said, the equality issue is not respected if you allow gender to be a part of the makeup of the electoral process. Actually, it does affect both the active and the passive vote, because your active vote for a female candidate has a higher weight, obviously, than your active vote for a male candidate. There are fewer women, and it's just more likely that the candidate you're choosing for a specific office has a higher chance of actually making it. So the equality of your vote is in question. Now, in that assessment of the federal Bundestag Research Center that I've already quoted, the research unit of the Parliament, Wissenschaftlicher Dienst. There is no such a thing in English-speaking countries, so it is a research facility aiding the members of parliaments for all kinds of requests. They are basically open to all kinds of queries from the members of parliament. I think the institute is totally unnecessary, because there are universities, there are interest groups, there are all kinds of people that can provide information, and that Wissenschaftlicher Dienst is just as close to your telephone as is any of the other entities you could call. Anyway, I can trust that the legal assessment provided by the Wissenschaftlicher Dienst is probably fairly accurate, or at least it was compiled by full-fledged attorneys who understand a bit about law. And in that legal assessment that I found, it says the principle of equal voting includes the same count and the same success value of one vote. The success value equality, that is called Erfolgswertgleichheit, demands that the success value of each vote for whichever candidate they cast will be equal. And the document also explains when a deviation from that principle is allowed, and they say a Differenzierung or Differenzierungen, which is verbatim for differentiations for whatever reason. They need compulsory reasons or obligatory, very important reasons, compulsory, there's no other way, reasons to deviate from the principle of equality. This was, however, clarified or rather diluted by our Supreme Court. This is the court verdict, you see here, the quotation. And they say the compulsory must be no other way. Reason for a deviation from those principles can be sufficient reasons for the nature of the matters of the election of the representative, and reasons for those. I don't really know what it means outside of that. It is diluting the concept of it's compulsory, you must have no other way but to deviate from the standards provided by the Constitution. However, the next sentence makes it a bit more clear. It says, among those reasons are the realization of the targets of the election, and one of those, or some of those, are the safeguarding of the character of the election as a movement or as a procedure for the formation of the political will of the people, and the guarantee of the functionality of the representatives that are to be elected. So the last bit means that the party leadership comes to decide who is skillful or competent enough to run for a seat in the parliament. It is not the ordinary member of the party that ultimately has to say. It is not the wider public, which could be the same. I mean, the fees of the party memberships aren't so high. And that is why it is so important. Basically, it's part of the election. If half of the parliament is reserved for these lists, then of course everybody can just join one of those parties likely to join the parliament and have their says about who ranks how high on those lists through those assemblies. But no, the parties have a right basically to deviate from the normal principles of equality and the other principles lined out in the Constitution if the leadership claims that the applicant is not competent, not skillful enough, or that it undermines the capacity of the party to help form the formation of people's will. Which I think is also quite Orwellian. It should be rather the opposite. The wider public should inform or tell parties what to do, and not parties' job. It should not be the party's job to form the will of the voters. Now let's have a look at how these lists are actually compiled. In Article 17 of the Parteiengesetz, or party law, it says the selection of the applicants for the election of the representation, that is the parliament, must be conducted in a secret election. In short, that means nothing but the lists have to be compiled in a secret manner. So the election for the positions on the list must be somehow secret. The selection is regulated by the election laws and the statutes of the parties. So this is delegated to other laws and to the party statutes. And in Article 21 of the Federal Election Law or Bundeswahlgesetz, it says, in a constituency nomination, candidates can only be named as candidates for a constituency who is not a member of another party and has been elected in a members' assembly or in a special or general assembly of representatives. Member assemblies for the election of a constituency candidate is an assembly of the members of the party who are entitled to vote at the time of their meeting and in the constituency of the German Bundestag. A special representative assembly is an assembly of representatives elected from among its members by such a member assembly. So what it means is that either can the members of the party directly select these candidates for the Bundestag in a general meeting, or they can create or they can send delegates to a representative meeting, to a representative assembly, which then would compile those candidate lists. In reality, I've never ever heard somebody say, well, I'm intending now the assembly to choose a candidate for the election list. So this is something I assume is never done, and I think the representative is usually linked to a separate party office. So somebody who will be responsible for, let's say, the party finances on a local level will also be designated at his election to be the delegate for the General Assembly, the party convention that is compiling the electoral list. At least this is my theory, because I've never so far heard of anybody taking part of the electoral list composition process. So how is it done at the party convention when the representatives, the delegates of the local communities come together to choose the candidates for their list? How are they supposed to do it? According to Article 21, Section 3 of the Federal Election Law, the applicants and the representatives for the Representative Assembly are elected by secret ballot. Every participant of the meeting who is entitled to vote is entitled to make proposals. The applicants are to be given the opportunity to present themselves and their program to the meeting in a reasonable time. The elections may take place at the earliest 32 months for the Representative Assembly, no earlier than 29 months after the beginning of the election period of the German Bundestag. Those statutes, I think, are utterly pointless. There's very little to say. Well, your average, your ordinary low-level party member must have a reasonable say. Instead, they have a fetish about deadlines. They always roll out a lot of deadlines, and I think this is mainly because new parties are to be hampered in a bureaucratic way. because this is just one example of a lot of questionable statutes where you wonder, okay, so why 32 weeks? In number 5 of the same paragraph, it says the party regulates the details of the election of the representative or the representative assembly, the invitations, and the qualifying quorum of the representative assembly, as well as the procedure for the election of the applicants through their statutes. So more and more bureaucracy is, of course, invited in on the party level too. So it makes it more difficult. So there are extra barriers for the average citizen to take part in this selection process. How the CSU is doing it, how they will manipulate the election to the effect that half of the list will be comprised of women and only the other half of men, even though men are far more interested in public affairs than women, and you have more candidates, etc., etc. How they will do it in the end is unclear, but they have announced already through the party leadership and the representative Markus Söder that they are going to do something. And this is worrying because, after all, we are not yet in a good position to begin with. Our election is not very transparent. Most people don't understand how it's done. And at least half of the parliament is taken by these obscure electoral lists, and the composition of which is not open to the wider public. That was it for today, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.